Today we're going to take a quick look at the TRC. The main thing for TRC is that there are case studies. That means that you're going to get sources with a victim and a perpetrator, and you're going to be asked questions about it. What I want to suggest to you is that you not panic about the TRC, because ultimately this is the one that more learners answer in the finals than any other question, simply because it is such a fascinating and interesting section. When we look at the TRC, we need to have a look at the fact that it was set up in 1995, but it was first suggested in 1993. So if you remember your Road to Democracy section, in 1993 an interim constitution was drawn up, and there they addressed the issue of what happens when the new South Africa comes into being after the elections, what happens about perpetrators of human rights violations during apartheid. Its aims were to investigate causes and the extent of human rights violations, recommend compensation, and grant amnesty. Now, amnesty is a very important word in this section, so make sure you can define it fully. It is the idea of that you will not be prosecuted in a court of law. You will be excused from your activities. And the condition was that you were truthful and that you gave full disclosure of the involvement. So what it focused on was restorative justice rather than retributive justice. You should remember this from your grade 11 project, the notion that you have two forms of justice. One is using the law system, using retribution, where you are going to punish the person for what they did wrong. The other one is restorative, can also go through the court system, but it is the notion that when people have done wrong, they need to be led to an understanding of the error of their ways, and they need to be led to restoring the relations with those who that were victims. When we look at the further aims, it wanted to see what were the gross violations. So there needed to be truth. There were people who denied that apartheid had negative elements to it. Because of press censorship, people didn't know exactly what had happened during apartheid. So the idea was that between March 1960 and 10th of May 1994, there would be research done, investigations done to determine what human rights violations existed, and this would allow for there to be truth about the murky past of apartheid. Grant amnesty to people who applied on certain conditions, such as that there was full disclosure and honesty and remorse shown. You had to show that you were sorry for what you had done. Establish the fate of the victims, because that would allow people to know what had happened to their family members, where were their remains, and it would restore dignity by giving people an opportunity to tell their story and to be heard, and for people to know what a sacrifice they had made in the struggle for apartheid. To compile a report of the TRC's activities and measures that would ultimately prevent future violations. And so the idea was that there'd be a culture of human rights in the country. Began in 1996 with 19 commissioners who traveled from town to town and would meet in a large venue, say a town hall, and then they would hear stories of victims and perpetrators. It wasn't rewriting history, it was a hands-on experience where there were witnesses, there were testimonies, and there was documentation. It wanted to promote reconciliation, but also find historical truth. 22,000 victims came forward. They were supposed to do it in 2 years, but it took much longer. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the chairman, Alex Boraine was the deputy, and a 5-volume report was eventually given to Mandela in 1998. I want you to realize that there were 7,000 amnesty applications. Only 1,000 of those were successful. 6,000 people had their amnesty applications rejected. And then there was the notion of reparation payments, that people should get compensation, a monetary compensation. It turned out to be not practical, and in many cases they moved towards, say, the Freedom Park or other memorials where people could go and remember their loved ones there. There were 3 separate committees. The Committee on Human Rights Violations was the one most visible. It was where 21,300 victims gave testimony. There were public testimonies, national coverage every night on the news, and you can find those clips on YouTube, public confessions and public meetings. Then there was the Committee on Reparations and Rehabilitations. They had to consult communities, individuals, provide emotional support, and investigate fully the stories so that they could call on a perpetrator to come forward and provide evidence on what had happened to the victim. And then there was a committee on amnesty, and it was their job to determine should a perpetrator be granted amnesty or not. So they received over 7,000 applications, but many of them were from convicted criminals in prison who were merely trying their luck, and they got turned down. So with the public hearings, there would be translators and earphones. They would travel from town to town. There would be a team of researchers. So very importantly, Mr. Dullah Omar, the Minister of Justice, said a commission is a necessary exercise to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past on a morally accepted basis and advance the cause of reconciliation. Most times when we do the TRC source-based questions, you are evaluating, did they advance the cause of reconciliation? Were they successful, or were they a failure in advancing reconciliation? So if you have a look at this lovely summary, you'll see that when you do the TRC, you have to look out for definitions such as amnesty, reparations, compensation, truth, reconciliation, perpetrators, victims, restorative, retributive. Then you look out for its aims, and I've covered a few in this video. Then you look out for those 3 committees that I touched on now. And then you look for failures and successes, and that is the bulk of the section of work. And ultimately you need case studies, so you need to know as many examples as you can of perpetrators, victims, what the experiences were at the TRC, and whether the TRC failed them or led them to a catharsis, to a moment of relief, a moment of understanding, and a moment of being able to have closure on what had happened to their loved ones. So healing. And that is the TRC section.